This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. On today's program, we're going to look at advanced technology that is currently operational in our society and world, and how this advanced technology and scientific developments have transformed the way that we live in. Now, this has been a great concern of mine for a long time. And probably like many of you, my knowledge and understanding of these subjects has grown both incrementally and exponentially as time passed. For example, it wasn't all that many years ago here in the state of California, where the state of California grassroots people wanted to demand that the big food industry giants that manufacture, there's like, what, 5 or major food corporations, and the people of California wanted to demand that on their products, like a can of soup or whatever, that they would have to list if they were using GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. And for most of you who understand what a GMO is, you have, let's say, a tomato, an orange, a cucumber, an apricot, or whatever, okay? And there's those crops, since God created the entire crop cycle, very specifically in the book of Genesis, those crops, they grow a cucumber or a lemon or a lime or whatever, corn, and they're harvested and people eat them and they use them for basically various nutritional products. And then the fruit or the vegetable or whatever always produces seed with it. And this is God's brilliant bioengineering. So you take a tomato and you cut a tomato in half, and in the center of the tomato you'll see tomato seeds. And if you plant the tomato seeds properly, it will grow a vine that will produce other tomatoes. If you cut open an apple, and by the way, it goes without saying, is that apples, oranges, or whatever it is, these really, if God wanted to be petty, he could trademark all of it because he invented all of it. So if you cut open an apple, you'll see apple seeds. And if you plant the apple seeds and you water it in the soil, etc., it will grow into an apple tree. And we could go on and on. The kernels of corn are seeds, and you could plant a new corn crop. Well, a particular GMO company, which used to be in the business of creating poisons to supposedly stop the spread of weeds. So this now huge company, which basically made its money developing a highly poisonous, highly effective weed killer, is now the company that owns a very large percentage of the genetically modified organisms or seeds. So this company moves from poisoning to bioengineering. Now, here's a couple of interesting bullet points. Number one is most of the seeds being genetically modified are unnatural. They're unnatural in the sense that even if they contain what looks like seeds, they're only good for one planting, or one sowing, one reaping or harvest, and then you can't use those seeds like you could for thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago and plant them in the ground or whatever again and expect to see another crop, another crop, another crop. They're only good for one cycle. They've been genetically modified. They can produce one harvest, and then they're impotent. You can plant the seeds to your heart's content. They will not produce apple trees or whatever. Now, why would they do this? Well, you already know the answer. Money. Money. If you can control the production of all food by owning the patent or copyright on the technology of new forms of vegetables and fruits, which contain when you buy that vegetable or fruit, it's good for one harvest. So what happens is that if you try to plant it again and it's genetically modified, it cannot reproduce. There will be no further harvest, which means you make the world very vulnerable to mass starvation and the killing off of billions of people. So this is done for money, greed. And then when we go to the third world nations and you have all this talk from the UN and all these other people talking about how we need to feed the hungry and feed the world and all the rest of this stuff, it's a bunch of hogwash because they are partnering with these GMO companies. And these poor farmers in third world nations have been able to eke out a living because they could always plant a particular crop and count on it to produce food for that year. Well, now the whole game has changed. These GMO companies have used their power, and the only way they can buy seeds is to purchase the seeds from the GMO company. And that seed is good for exactly one crop cycle. And then they can't just take God's tomatoes and God's oranges, etc., and plant the seeds again and grow another harvest. They have already planted a harvest, those seeds, because their GMO seeds can't reproduce again. So they have to go back. They're forced to go back to the GMO company. They're dirt poor to begin with, and they're forced to purchase with what little money they have. Every year they have to purchase a new bunch of seeds, which is good for only one crop. If they don't, they will starve to death. So this is what is going on across the world. And so to talk about, feeding the hungry, social justice, compassion, globalism is all total nonsense in light of the reality. The nickname for these new kinds of seeds are Terminator seeds. They're called Terminator seeds because they're good, once again, for one crop, and after that, they're dead. And so there are people very high up who know full well what they're doing, and the real purpose of this is for mass euthanasia, mass killing off of excessive population, because there's no reason whatsoever to sell people seeds that are only good for one crop. It's really a rape of God's creation. Now, the other thing is, in order to increase profit, other things that they genetically modify in fruits, vegetables, etc., is they can make, tomatoes look redder, taste juicier, grow much, much faster. When they first started out with the genetically modified foods, all the food tastes terrible. I remember back in the days that when they didn't tell the public, but all the tomatoes, I remember, tasted like saran wrap. And you would have to have been born at a particular age to know what I'm talking about. A lot of the fruits and vegetables that you would buy at the big supermarkets, they tasted horrible. They had no taste in them. And I didn't know why at the time. This is like 20 years ago, because they kept it hush-hush. The reason it tasted horrible is because they genetically modified the seed so that the fruits and the vegetables would grow much, much faster, much, much bigger, be much more colorful, withstand changes in temperature, but they had not yet perfected the GMO to produce the same sweet or same natural taste, so they didn't taste very good. Well, they fixed that a long time ago. Genetically modified organisms, fruits and vegetables, etc., can often taste better, can often look healthier, they're often bigger, the colors are richer than the natural or organic fruits and vegetables, which are using God's original seed. So a lot of times people who don't know very much about it are shopping and they're trying to stay healthy, and they'll see the organic section of fruits and vegetables right next to the genetically modified organisms. And they'll go, gee, the organic stuff looks like it's sickly. It doesn't look very healthy. Well, they're wrong. It just hasn't been artificially enhanced. Now, the other thing is, in the process of tinkering with the DNA and the genetics of God's fruits and vegetables, they have made all kinds of alterations. They are not fully aware of the impact of all the alterations, but we do know that many of these alterations are producing crop after crop all across the world of genetically modified organisms or fruits and vegetables, etc., that lack the proper nutritional content, that create susceptibilities to disease. When you eat them and stuff like that, they create vulnerabilities to diseases and other such things. They create vulnerabilities to diseases because they're tinkering genetically way beyond their level of expertise, and they're playing dirty little games, such as they're making the genetically modified crops and seeds deliberately genetically altered so that they are genetically resistant to, let's say, a farmer is trying to grow a pure organic crop of whatever, tomatoes, vegetables, apples, whatever. Okay. Now, this farmer's trying not to use pesticides and additives and things like that. But there's a peculiar thing about all these new genetically modified fruits and vegetables. They grow like weeds intentionally because they've been genetically engineered. And so what they'll do is they'll easily, farmers will create dirt barriers between a GMO crop and the organic crop. Farmers will do all kinds of things to separate and protect the two different fields because an organic farmer doesn't want his crops infected, if you will, with the genetically modified organisms, which can happen from the wind blowing seeds. But most often it happens because in the same way weeds are very aggressive and tenacious, well, genetically modified organisms in the form of, let's say, tomatoes or oranges or apples or zucchinis or whatever it is, cherries, they now, because they've been genetically re-engineered, they have a tenacity and an aggressiveness, and they will deliberately cross over any barrier, and they will begin to infect, if you will, and grow among the organic crop, thus destroying the organic farmer's crop, and he can't sell it legally as an organic crop. And one of the ways that is done is that, again, the organic farmer tries not to use pesticides, etc. But in the land where there's no danger of pesticide runoff, etc., the organic farmers will use pesticides safely away from their crop, safely away from the crop of the GMO company. But those pesticides are simply put in there or poisons to be a barrier to keep the GMO crops from crossing the border and destroying and transforming the organic crops. But because the GMO crops are genetically re-engineered, they are hyper-resistant, and they just invade the organic crops anyway. And that slight chemical modification, that slight genetic modification that enables them to do that also has some very bad health consequences for the human body. So what they're discovering is that a lot of these genetically modified foods, even though they look pretty, they taste pretty, they grow quickly, they're not healthy for you, and they contain, a lack of enzymes, a lack of nutrients, a lack of the original genetic design that God created in them to make them healthy. And so this is one of the reasons why people in America and around the world, even though they have an abundance of food and they're supposedly eating their fruits and vegetables, the supposed healthy food, the stuff that's supposed to have antioxidants and be very healthy for you, if that food that you're eating is genetically modified, it's going to be seriously lacking in its ability to produce health, and this causes a widespread vulnerability to disease, and something that we all want to look out for. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. We're going to continue on in just a moment, because these are just some of the scientific changes that are happening in our world, and you need to be aware of it, and you need to be proactive. We'll be back in just a second. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. A friend of mine, Joe Horn, who is one of the sons of Tom Horn, wrote a book with Allie Anderson called Time Bomb, a genocide of deadly processed foods. And it turned out that Joe Horn and Tom Horn were doing intensive research on nutrition and genetically modified organisms and stuff, basically at the same time I was, but I didn't know about it until their book came out, because God led them to research in this area, because they want to extend their lives at least to the longevity of years that God promises. And so I became very interested in this also, and I've been studying this now for years and trying to implement it as best I can in our diets and stuff, and trying to encourage other people to do the same thing, because you will live longer. I'm reading from a passage of Time Bomb, and I'm going to read to you something from page 50, where Joe Horn talks about in the 1990s, a particular company introduced the first genetically engineered tomato. And he writes that this tomato took 8 years and more than $20 million to produce the world's first genetically modified tomato. And supposedly this new and improved tomato was designed to be picked ripe and last longer in this ripened state. And before they perfected this genetically modified tomato, the problem was tomatoes were being picked deliberately green. Remember, in those days, it was only a couple of years ago, when most supermarkets, food supermarkets, would deliberately pick crops, tomatoes, vegetables, and stuff that were deliberately not ripe, deliberately green, or deliberately didn't taste good because they were deliberately not ripened, thus giving them time to ripen while they waited on the shelf for somebody to buy it. It's the same with like avocados today. You buy avocados from the store, basically they're not ripe, and so you have to put them up on the counter in your kitchen or whatever for a couple of days till they get ripe, and then you put them back in the refrigerator. Okay, so these genetically modified tomatoes were sent to the stores, and they were packaged and stuff to ripen just before they were put on display for sale in the stores. And this helped the food industry prevent, having to sell soggy tomatoes that were overripe and squishy, which is, that's a legitimate concern. So the actual genetic engineering, that process that this company used, turned off what could be called a softening gene. So, they don't know what they're doing, is what I'm gathering here. So the softening gene, the switch in the tomato that eventually makes it go soft and not overripe, but soft, and gives it a good taste, well, they turned it off. So when these tomatoes hit the market, they were inundated with phone calls from consumers, because the consumers are going, these tomatoes aren't acting, they're acting weird, they're not acting like real tomatoes. So this company, unlike some companies, obviously had some integrity, and it put a label on the tomato packaging that the tomatoes were a GMO, or a genetically modified organism product. Okay. So then the same company had to spend, I guess, millions of more dollars, where they had to conduct 3 28-day studies where they were feeding their tomatoes to lab rats and testing what would happen. And this is what happened. Both, they came up with two different genetically modified lines of tomatoes. Both lines included the same type of tomato, but one, they inserted another gene, which was followed by the cloning of the cell into the plant. And what that creates is very slight genetic variations when you insert this cloned gene. It's like a Frankenstein thing. When you insert this cloned gene into a tomato. So they used this and tried this with many different scientific studies. And when the first study was concluded, each of the two genetically engineered lines of tomato were fed separately to 2 sample populations of rats. And the initial reports from making this itsy-bitsy change in the genetics of the tomatoes among 2 different rat populations. One rat population was fed the genetically engineered line of tomato, and those rats ate the tomato, and they remained healthy rats. But the second line of rats that ate the genetically modified tomato with the cloned gene, 7 of the 20 rats developed bleeding stomach lesions, tumors, and some of them died. Now, the important point here is that what they were trying to genetically modify by cloning a gene was a minor thing. They weren't trying to restructure the nature of a tomato. This all had to do with the softening process. But to show you how intricate God's creation is and how dangerous it is to tinker with it when you don't fully understand what you're doing, just by that relatively small degree of tinkering with God's genetic design, it created a tomato that was essentially killing a high percentage of the rats that were eating it. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if these same tomatoes were to be passed on to the human population. Okay? And let's say you fed 27 young children these tomatoes. Well, based on these statistics, 8 of them would have died or developed serious health problems by simply eating that tomato. So, to me, that's serious, especially if it's your kid, right? Who has serious problems, lesions, tumors, and death because they're eating a tomato that's been, a gene has been cloned and genetically modified. So, the governmental authorities decide to classify the results of this company as possible treatment-related problems. In other words, somebody got paid off to say something because they didn't tell the truth. They didn't tell the truth, which was to all the rats, to the 27 rats, and they did a number of studies, to the 27 rats where we gave them the genetically modified tomato, 8 of the 27 had serious medical problems and some of them died. That's a big, big thing. So they got a government agency to conceal that and change the language in the warning. They let the tomato be sold on the market because scientists within the FDA acknowledged that the tomatoes failed to, quote, exhibit reasonable certainty of no harm, which is the normal standard of safety determined by the FDA. Okay, I don't know what the FDA's criteria is or not, but let's be really honest. You multiply that out, instead of 2,700 rats, say it's 2,700,000 school children, okay? And let's say, half of the school children are getting a normal tomato that has not been genetically engineered. Okay, that's fine, there's no problems. The other half are getting the clone gene and the genetically modified tomatoes, which have been officially categorized and approved as no scientific basis proving the tomato was unsafe. So using the same statistics on rats and just applying it to people, if out of 2,700,000 children in school were given genetically modified tomatoes that cause lesions, tumors, and even death, that the percentage was 8 in 2,700 developed death, lesions, and tumors. So you can do the statistics and multiply that out. 800,000 out of 2,700,000 students being fed a genetically modified tomato leads easily into the category of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dire health consequences, tumors, lesions, deaths, and then you multiply it out by even more because more than 2,700,000 kids eat tomatoes each year. And now you have this mysterious thing that's killing kids all over the United States and the world, and trusting parents don't know why. And what if it's your kid? What if it's your friend's kid? What if it's somebody you work with kid? Then you see it gets really personal. We're not just making it an abstract thing. Somebody's life ceases to exist because somebody in a government agency, for whatever reason, said these genetically modified organism tomatoes were safe when they weren't. And we're not just talking about tomatoes. We're talking about thousands of crops, thousands of food items. And if it's your kid that dies or suffers something extremely serious, then all of a sudden reality hits home. It really shouldn't happen to any kid. But when you talk about your own kid or somebody you know, for some reason our filters are disengaged, and we look at reality much more honestly. So there was a huge media blitz around the discoveries of this tomato. There was public relations campaigns which showed people proudly tasting the tomatoes and professing their confidence in the product, and who apparently were unfazed by the fact that it was labeled a genetically modified organism. And then there were people who were dubious or skeptical. Now, I'm not going to pass judgment on exactly what happened because I don't know exactly what happened here. But if, hypothetically speaking, the company that was producing these genetically modified tomatoes had hired or paid people or selectively picked people to go on camera and give praise reports about how wonderful these GMO foods are, okay, knowing full well that they statistically have the possibility to give disease and death to children. Those executives in that company that manufactures genetically modified organism tomatoes are criminals. And let's face it, I mean, let's just say it for what it is. And I'm not speaking about any one particular company. I'm saying that because of the lack of Christian morality in American society, where people don't believe in right and wrong anymore, whether we can take any industry. Let's just take the food industry. I don't know how many, 4 or 8 large multinational corporations control all of the food basically that's sold to the average American. Well, to use your money for PR and hire a director or actors and editors and stuff to produce propaganda films and commercials showing smiling people eating your tomatoes, okay, when you know full well statistically a certain percentage of them are going to get serious illnesses and die, you're a criminal. You're a criminal. You may sit in a white-collar office and be respected at the country club, but you're a criminal. And we got a lot of criminals in American society. So, this company obviously had a lot of money to defend itself, and there was a big public relations argument. Which said a lie, that there was no scientific basis proving the tomato was unsafe. That's a lie. Arguments against the approval of the tomato and other incoming GMO foods dubbed them as scientifically unfounded. Now that's a lie also, because at the very least, with all this genetically modified food, and you're dealing with tinkering with God's genetic codes for fruit and vegetables, the honest answer is these scientists have no idea what the full ramifications are to their genetic tinkering, because it's way beyond their understanding right now. In addition, the FDA, which is designed to protect the American consumer and families, has conspicuously approved a lot of drugs, approved a lot of foods, a lot of genetically modified foods. It has approved a lot of things which people have very, very serious concerns about. So why is it they're in such a big rush to approve all kinds of products and drugs and stuff which have serious questions attached to them? Now, we're not just talking about tomatoes. We're talking about every vegetable and fruit under the sun. So, what happened was this company that was making the genetically modified tomato was bought out by a very well-known, the most famous GMO company in the world. And why would the most famous GMO company in the world buy out this genetically engineered tomato manufacturer? Well, we may not know the full answer. But the point is, the takeaway from this is that scientists, nutritionists, biochemists, molecular biologists, and other true experts have been raising the alarm about the safety of genetically modified or GMO foods for decades. And they have shown the results of scientific experimentation that proves the negative effects of GMO foods on human beings and rats, and the negative health consequences of what is called the gene insertion process. So this is just one tip of the iceberg, and you need to be concerned about it because nobody's looking out for you. The government agencies that are supposed to be looking out for you are turning a blind eye for profit. And why is that? Why is that? Because you see, all these cancers, all these autoimmune diseases that people have, arthritis. I mean, we could go down a list of 25, 30 diseases that are like an epidemic right now. Where did they come from? They just didn't come from nowhere. They came from something. And they have come from some kind of toxin, some kind of poison. Something has been changed in our food supply and in our environment, or something that we're adding to our bodies that is man-made, that has changed negatively our internal biology. You know, most of you can remember there was a time that there was a small percentage of Americans that had diseases of the mind like dementia and Alzheimer's. When I was a kid, hardly anybody had dementia or Alzheimer's. People would live old ages. Eventually they'd get sick and die. But the majority of people could remember, were of sound mind in their latter years. I mean, the words Alzheimer's and dementia were hardly ever used. It was so non-existent. And then all of a sudden, I don't know what, a decade or two ago, all of a sudden, all kinds of older people are getting Alzheimer's and dementia, where they can't remember stuff. They're losing their cognitive faculties. Why? How did that happen? I'll tell you how it happened, and I can't tell you specifically, but I suspect that something, either intentionally or unintentionally, was added to the food supply, the water supply, either a secondary impact from EMF waves, chemical additives in our food, toxins in chemtrails. Something was added to our foods, something was added to drugs and medication or vaccines. People are receiving a brain-killing poison of one kind or another, which is triggering an epidemic in Alzheimer's and dementia, because there was no epidemic of Alzheimer's and dementia going back 30, 40 years ago. So how did it appear out of nowhere? How did it appear out of nowhere? And see, you and I, let's be honest, it's very difficult to live in this world, because every time, if you're honest and you're trying to do the right thing and you're paying attention, every time you turn around, it seems like you're facing another spiritual battle, and it can be exhausting. But let me just share this with you. As exhausting as it is, it's better to keep up the good fight of faith and to learn as much as you can by self-education and to be proactive as best as you can. Because, you know, there are supplements, there is nutrition, there's things like physical exercise, etc., which they can't be offered up as cures to Alzheimer's and dementia. But scientific research studies have revealed that they significantly reduce the possibility and the severity of these mind-killing diseases. And so I believe that a lot of people God wants to bless with a lot longer and happier life, but they got to do their part. And as you're going to hear me say on the Paul McGuire Report endlessly, knowledge is power. It is imperative that you self-educate yourself. That doesn't mean you have to be an expert or a genius on everything. Nobody can do that. But you need to read and study and acquire information outside of the official programmed lying information that's being distributed. You need to self-educate. And if you choose to do that, you will have more power, more victory, and more overcoming in your life. And it's not that hard, okay? And so I really want to, out of love, by the way, the Bible says love your neighbor as yourself. If I really love you with the agape love of Jesus Christ, I'm not just going to come to you with a bunch of pious platitudes and tell you how wonderful you are and just say, praise the Lord. That's lying to you. I'm going to roll up my sleeves. I'm going to do what I can in terms of researching and whatever. And then I'm going to disseminate that information to you so that you can use it, because real love confronts and real love cares about other people. And if I discover, for example, that with some minor changes, you can radically change your life, your lifespan, then if I say I love you, as God commands me to, then I'm under orders from Jesus to put that love into action and get you that information. It's really that simple. That's what real love is. Real love is not copping out and saying Jesus loves you, patting you in the back, and then letting your mind, allowing you to lose your mind to Alzheimer's or dementia or some other disease when it could have been prevented. Okay? So many things could be prevented. I'm Paul McGuire. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. And remember this, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Oh, back to the whole thing with the GMO foods. So the people of California voted overwhelmingly. Of course, big companies spent millions and millions of dollars lying, but the people of California voted overwhelmingly to force the government and all these food companies to list on the labels of their foods, whether it's a can of soup or juice or whatever it is. They were forced to label whether or not they were using GMO foods, genetically modified organisms, and they were forced to list information about the GMOs that they were using in their food products. Now, that's just normal, man. A parent has a right to know that. And so I don't know what legal, politically trickery they used, but even after the people of California overwhelmingly voted to force the food manufacturers to display whether or not they were using GMO foods and what kind of GMO foods, somehow, when you go into a food supermarket in California, whatever listing is there, you'd need a microscope to find it. They somehow use their power and influence to not have to obey the voice of we the people. And that's what we got to watch out for, because the FDA should be fighting for our rights, not fighting for the right of the GMO companies. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. You are listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. You know, it's absolutely amazing how the Bible, which was written, a great deal of it was written thousands and thousands of years ago, the inspired and inerrant Word of God. One of the proofs of the fact that that the Word of God is God's supernatural word is the depth of His intelligence and understanding that He reveals in His Word thousands and thousands and thousands of years before mankind is anything. And I'll give you an example. God was obviously, as the Creator, capital C, totally aware of genetics, DNA, and God created laws regarding genetics and laws regarding DNA, 5,000 years or more before mankind had a clue what DNA and what genetics was all about. So when we look at the book of Genesis, we read a principle, which we've looked at before, but it's a principle that is so powerful and important that it needs to be repeated on a basis. So in Genesis chapter 11, starting at verse 11, then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herbs that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So God hates, let's just, for a lack of better words, say, by calling it a biological mechanism, a biological formula upon which all seed-bearing plants, fruits, and even mankind and the animals conceive regarding a seed and an egg. And the fundamental law that God is illustrating is that, first of all, in the creation, in the Garden of Eden, God created man to be totally healthy, etc. But everything that God created, He called good. And therefore, all fruits, all vegetables, everything that God created was healthy, vibrant, contained life force, it was nutritious, and it wasn't diseased, it didn't kill you, and it didn't corrupt you. But here is one of the rules that God embedded in, let's call it, His laws of creation. And He begins to reveal it in verse 11. "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed." Okay, so the first thing we learned about is grass and herbs that yield seed. So a seed is an essential process. Every crop yields a seed, so that seed can be planted again and reap another crop. And it goes on continuously. Therefore, the way God created the world, there could be no food shortages or mass starvations, because you have the law of a crop, which is a seed. The seed can be planted and it reaps another crop, and it goes on infinitely. So then we learn another principle of God's creation. The herb that yields seed and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herbs that yield seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So we see in to be called God's law of genetic creation, because God created the genetic code, by the way, and DNA. One of the primary maxims or scientific laws that God used to create the natural order is that everything that reproduces is in a particular and specific species or category. So let's say that again. Everything that God created, every living thing that God created, can be classified or categorized as being part of a unique species. And according to God's law of creation, when any particular species reproduces by producing a seed, the law of God's genetic codes states that a fruit has to yield fruit according to its kind or according to its species, whose seed is in itself and on the earth. Or, for example, the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields a species according to its kind, grass, the herb species. The tree yields fruit, and God saw that it was good. So we see here that God has a very specific law. Every species has to reproduce after its own kind or after its own species. There is no example in all of creation of the 80 million fossil records that evolutionary biologists have found. There is not one fossil record that shows us that one seed or one species ever transformed or evolved itself into a completely different species or a higher order species. So God's genetic creative laws state that once something is in a species, it can evolve inside the same kind of species, but it can never evolve into another or higher species. Now, that's the difference between macroevolution and microevolution. Microevolution would be the fact that, you have a strep throat and you go to the doctor and he gives antibiotics, but the strep throat comes back. Okay, it's still what's plaguing your body is a strep throat. But because so many other people have strep throats and so many other people have treated it with antibiotics, that particular species of strep throat has developed an immunity and it's become stronger than the antibiotic. Now, that doesn't mean that the species of strep throat has changed into something else. It simply means that there has been growth or transformation or mutation within the species of strep throat that makes it resistant to antibiotics. It in no way suggests that the strep throat has evolved into something else. And basically, that's what you call microevolution. Now, macroevolution is looking down at the earth and seeing a tadpole and saying because of wind and environmental factors and the passage of 40 billion years, that the tadpole has somehow evolved into men and women, which is nonsense. Okay, so we read again and again, verse 21. So God created the great sea creatures, every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded according to their kind, species, and every winged bird according to its kind, species. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters and the seas, let the birds multiply on the earth. Verse 24, Then God said, Let the earth bring forth living creature according to its kind, species, cattle and creeping thing, and the beast of the earth, each according to its kind, species. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. These are all separate and distinct species. Okay. When man genetically modifies the genetic code of whatever it is, he's not making one species into another species. But what he's doing is he's tinkering with the code and changing the species. The problem with that is it's a highly dangerous thing. And number two is it's inherently selfish if you're doing it is for the purpose of making more money. If you're forcing starving farmers in third world nations to buy seeds that are called Terminator seeds because they're only good for one planting and one crop, and then you have to come back to the corporation that sells you the seed for the next year's seeds, that's a form of cruelty and oppression. Because, first of all, the seeds, the crops, should never have been allowed to be stolen, or be acquired, and controlled by these corporations. These were God's gift to mankind to keep mankind alive. And so what they're doing is they're killing people. So we need to be aware of the dangers of what we're eating. The genetically modified foods that we're eating that are toxic, that can create cancer, and all kinds of things. I remember when I was hosting my other radio program called The Paul McGuire Show, and I had a nutritional advertiser. And I remember the nutritional advertiser because I would always meet extensively with my advertisers. So I never wanted to just misrepresent products and services to my listeners. I wanted the people on my show to have integrity. So, I questioned this person at length, and they told me something to the effect that the average glass of milk that the average teenager or whatever drinks has a total of something like 80 chemicals, hormones, and additives in it. So essentially, the average glass of milk is toxic because it has everything in it. And that's not necessarily good for you. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. We'll be back in a second. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. In this program, we're giving you an overview. And one of the things I want to encourage you to do is to learn how to think outside of the box regarding health, nutrition, fighting disease, toxicity, and stuff like that. Because if you think only inside the box, you're going to deprive yourself of very powerful healers and healing agents. Another thing I want to mention up front, I in no way claim to be a medical doctor, a medical researcher, a licensed physician. So none of what I'm telling you should be construed as medical advice. If you're looking for medical advice, you need to seek out a licensed medical physician or medical professional that hopefully specializes in the field where you have a need. So again, in the strongest terms, I'm not giving you a prescription. I'm not giving you a formula. I'm not pretending to be a doctor. You do need to see a doctor and trained, licensed medical professionals. Now, having done that, you have to make decisions. You have to compare, and that's up to you. I want to talk about autoimmune diseases for just a moment, because autoimmune diseases are growing in their diversity and their impact on people, especially in the last 5 to 30 years. There are a whole lot of autoimmune diseases. Some of the ones that you may have heard of or you yourself may have experienced are things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, Lyme disease, Epstein-Barr virus, and many other illnesses that are loosely categorized as autoimmune diseases, such as Gulf War syndrome, Gulf War illness, engineered microorganisms, mycoplasma, chemical and biological warfare, AIDS, and how they interaffect with MK Ultra, Project Naomi, and what some scientists have said is that deliberate biological plagues have escaped out of laboratories. Mycoplasma is a bacteria, but it's a bacteria without a cell wall. So it's a very primitive bacteria, and it's lost a lot of its genetic information. And mycoplasma is part of a cell membrane. So these are things that you want to pay attention to, and there's a high likelihood that your average doctor, who may be very well-meaning, but he or she most likely only heard one side of the story. So we have to understand that there is a systematic and strategic effort, which could be categorized as there is an attack on our health. Whether in every case this attack is deliberate, or it's done out of a profit motive, or it's done by making accidental mistakes, etc. I'll leave that up to you. But our health is under attack, serious attack. Because these autoimmune diseases, which all indicate a lack of proper functioning of our God-given immune systems, our immune systems are impaired. For example, mycoplasma and AIDS and the relationship between that, but how mycoplasma interfaces with other autoimmune diseases that chances are somebody you know and love, maybe yourself, has to deal with this. I meet with people all the time, and I have for years, who are suffering. Many times I think it's undiagnosed. I'm not going to diagnose them because I'm not a doctor, but they have chronic fatigue syndrome. They have fibromyalgia. They have things that are just, deadly. And the big pharmaceutical industries appear not to really want to cure these diseases, whether it's cancer, arthritis, or whatever it is. Treating people is a big money-making business. And from an economic standpoint, they don't seem to have an incentive, a financial incentive of curing you, but keeping you in the treadmill of taking endless medications that barely enable you to cope, but you never really get up over it. And then the other question has to be asked is, are these medicines, are these treatments attacking the real problem? Are they attacking the root problem? An example of that would be, and there's a difference of opinion between scientists and researchers, but, big pharma and the medical industry have like an incestuous relationship. And regarding the autoimmune diseases, there are many high-level doctors and medical researchers who theorize that the root problem behind fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, Epstein-Barr, Lyme disease, and many other autoimmune diseases is an actual biologically made, man-made bacteria as a biological weapon that escaped into the population. But the reason it's so difficult to detect is because even though it's a bacteria, it masquerades and produces symptoms like it's a virus. So people are taking all these concoctions, all these medicines, all these treatments, and they're not experiencing healing from their autoimmune disease. And again, I'm not a doctor, but the question is the reason they're not experiencing a permanent cure from their autoimmune disease, is it because the doctors are not treating the root of the disease? Let's say, hypothetically, that it really is a bacteria, but not just an ordinary bacteria, a bacteria that was manufactured in a biological plague laboratory that makes it a super disease. It's designed to be resistant to all kinds of antibiotics and traditional treatments, but it was designed to be a plague, to kill people. And it produces chronic illnesses. Now, the thing is, those things just don't go away unless they are properly diagnosed, which most often they're not. Because you see, you take Lyme disease, and the first thing they're going to ask you if you have a Lyme disease test, which could be an indicator of a biological plague bacteria. There are many kinds of Lyme disease tests. So you have to have the right kind of Lyme disease test in relationship to where you live geographically. Otherwise, it's going to produce a false result. The other thing is, people say, because they're not experts in the field, well, you don't have a bacteriological infection. You have a virus. But what they fail to understand is that many of the autoimmune diseases they're tricky. They masquerade as both viruses and bacteriological infections. And so they fool doctors that don't specifically specialize in these areas. And then another problem that people face, and remember, there's a whole range of autoimmune diseases. I just named a few. They go to the doctor. They tell the doctor they're depressed, they're in pain, they're tired, they're fatigued, they sleep all the time. Well, immediately, not all doctors, but most doctors don't believe that things like fibromyalgia really exist, or that these autoimmune diseases really exist. They think that they're psychosomatic illnesses. So instead of treating you biologically for a real bacteriological or viral infection, they're not you, but secretly they think you have a psychological problem and that your real problem is depression, clinical depression. So they think that the reason you're sleeping, the reason you're in pain, the reason you're in fatigue, the reason you're lying in bed all day is not because you have a bacteriological infection. It's because you have a psychological problem. And so they attempt to cure you by giving you, a traditional range of psychological medications that will boost serotonin or boost dopamine and GMO'S, which is a very flaky theory, by the way. The theory is that, well, the pain that my patient is suffering from acute pain, okay, or acute fatigue, such as in fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome. So they say, okay, if I boost the serotonin levels, that's the kind of optimism, upbeat, natural chemical in your body. If I boost their serotonin levels by giving them an antidepressant that's serotonin-based, when they're more in a level emotionally and their serotonin levels are higher, it will nullify the pain, it will reduce the pain, it will reduce the anxiety, that will cure the insomnia and the hypersensitivity to pain and temperatures. And they may mean well, because from a traditional medical sense, yes, serotonin, when it's increased, has the effect of reducing pain, improving mood, curing insomnia. So you would think, okay, that's great, you're winning, but you're not really winning, because sooner or later, you've just put a Band-Aid over not a scratch, something that needs stitches. And so what will happen inevitably is, because the root problem is that somehow or another you've been infected with a powerful man-made bacteria, perhaps the bacteria of a biological plague. And these things are like next to impossible to get rid of. This bacteria is going to erupt in your mind, body, system, and you'll go through another round of hellish fatigue, disorientation, brain fog, lack of focus, lack of energy, depression, and they will assume you have a psychological problem, which puts guilt and shame on you, because the bottom line is you don't have a psychological problem. You have a real old-fashioned bacteria problem. You're infected with a real bacteria that really exists, that can really be seen under a microscope. And not only that, you just didn't get a natural bacteria. You happen to have gotten one of the most potent, virulent strains of bacteria, and that was one managed to escape from a secret man-made biological plague laboratory. And this isn't a joke. People's lives can be destroyed and shortened because of this. This is why I say to you, knowledge is power. And if you're not going to be your own advocate, and maybe you don't have the energy to be your own advocate, I understand that, then get somebody to help you. Or if you have to stay in bed all day resting, and maybe you have 2 hours of energy a day, I've met people like that. Then spend an hour of that day doing some reading. Because there are organizations, there are groups, there's doctors that really understand what you're going through, and they're not going to give you a formula answer. One of the most breakthrough scientific discoveries has been that a great deal of healing occurs when we make sure that we have the proper amount of what they call prebiotics and probiotics, which is simply said the healthy bacteria in our intestine and stomachs. And healthy bacteria, stuff like acidelphus, any other strains of acidelphus-like friendly bacterias and prebiotics and probiotics. We need to saturate our bodies with enzymes, digestive enzymes, prebiotics and probiotics, because these things are powerful disease killers. They help get rid of bacteria, viruses, they boost the immune system. But your average doctor has no clue whatsoever about how powerful they are as healers. And so, for example, a lot of people are suffering terribly who have a wide spectrum of autoimmune diseases. And one of the symptoms of these autoimmune diseases, besides fatigue, brain fog, depression, is nausea. And nausea can just, it's like having food poisoning. It's horrible. So people are in pain because they have this overall sense of acute nausea. And they're told by their doctors it's anxiety or a psychological problem. Well, it may be, but it may not be. It may be, and which is often the case, their system has a desperate lack of friendly bacteria, prebiotics, probiotics, things like acidelphus, and if you were to regularly and enzymes, and if you were regularly to saturate your body with the good enzymes, the good friendly bacteria, the prebiotics and the probiotics, guess what happens? You take that stuff, and in 3 hours, your nausea is gone. You don't have that horrible nausea. Now, I didn't find that out from doctors. I found out from talking to alternative nutritional people. I remember that, once every 2 or 3 years, I would get a horrible case of food poisoning. I didn't have it that often, but I had it a bunch of times in my life. It was hell on earth. And those of you that have had bad food poisoning know exactly what I'm talking about. I had some Italian food that we should have thrown away, but in my greed, I left it in the refrigerator. And I served it to myself and my family, and it was like we were dying for 3 days. Because nausea is very painful and sickening. I did not know at the time that you don't have to suffer for a week due to food poisoning. That you don't have to run to get antibiotics, although that may be necessary. That's why I'm saying you need to check that out with a medical doctor first. But in many cases, and again, you need a doctor, I discovered that if you take a powerful range of friendly bacteria, probiotics and prebiotics and enzymes, within a day or two, that nausea is gone. Because the probiotics, the prebiotics, stuff like acidophilus and many other strains, it completely gets rid of the nausea. And it actually kills the bacteria that's in the food that's giving you the food poisoning. I mean, these are simple things, but nobody ever told me that. Okay, let's look at something else here that is imperative to understand. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. Hopefully, the contents or part of the contents of this show will help people and open doors for you for healing. And again, I encourage you to think outside of the box. Knowledge is power. And look, if I respect doctors, I'm not pretending to be a doctor. You need to go to a licensed medical professional or doctor first, especially when you're dealing with your health. But doctors don't know everything. I remember going to a particular female doctor about 2 or 3 years ago, and I told her I was taking friendly bacteria to deal with something. And she looked at me like I was crazy. She had no idea what friendly bacteria is or was. And I had to explain it to her. And I said to myself, this woman knows nothing. How can you call yourself a doctor and have no idea about the amazing medical benefits of friendly bacteria, acidophilus, and things like that? You know why? Because almost every doctor I've talked to, they have told me that when they graduated from medical school, they only took one course on nutrition. That's hardly enough. This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. This is the Paul McGuire Report, and it's very important to understand that we're dealing with a wide diversity of potential medical health attacks on our bodies and our minds, etc., which doesn't mean we need to walk around in a state of paranoia. And again, seeking out the advice of a trained, licensed medical professional who specializes in the field that you're trying to get information about is essential. And there's a biblical principle where you get a variety of opinions, and then prayerfully you choose and make a choice. It's like if you visit an attorney or an auto mechanic or whatever, you just don't go with the first potential diagnosis or whatever, because they could be wrong. So let's just review some basic things. The first thing you can do in terms of protecting yourself is you need to do everything you can on a daily, weekly basis to build up and supercharge your immune system, no matter what age you are. Now, I cannot stress to you how important that is, because you see, we live in an unusually highly toxic world where the average person is exposed to a far greater amount and a far greater potency and potential danger of bacteria, viruses, toxins that they weren't exposed to 10, 20, 30 years ago. So when you travel in a jet plane, and I do a lot of traveling for conference speaking, and I don't like it, because you're shoved in crowded conditions through security. That itself is not healthy because you're breathing and touching stuff that has bacteria or airborne bacteria or whatever. Every time you shake somebody's hand or show them a driver's license or whatever, there's the potential transmission of bacteria or infections on it. And then when you're in the jet airplane, and some people know this, but a lot of people don't, so I'll review it anyway. However long your flight is, I mean, you could be in that jet for 8 hours or 4 hours or 3 hours. You are breathing recycled air. That is not clean air, as far as I know. It is not purified air. It's a small amount of air in which people breathing, inhaling, and exhaling into the atmosphere of the plane can potentially have all kinds of diseases, biologically and virally. And you're breathing that air being recycled over and over again in the cabin of the plane. And that's why, I do everything I can to maintain my health. Others do too when I travel. But I have friends and family and I'm continually picking up germs and all kinds of colds and flus and everything else simply through air transportation because you're breathing infected air. A lot of people make light of some people from Asian nations who walk around the airport or walk around LA or walk into a plane and they have one of those white filter cups, that you strap over your nose and mouth, and it has like a rubber band that attaches to the back of your head. And people think they're silly. They're not silly. They're smart. They know how much bacteria is in the air, and that would prevent a bacterial infection. So don't feel foolish about doing that. Number two is the person next to you. You're sitting next to them in the closest of proximities for hours. Whatever they have, you're breathing it in. The same with the person in front of you, the same with the person in back of you. They may not be manifesting an illness, but they're carrying a particular illness. And then you get it 2 or 3 days after you finish traveling. The door handles in the plane, the seats, the way they keep restructuring the bathrooms. And this may sound ridiculous, but I was watching a news program talking about how that the airlines have continually redesigned the bathrooms to be smaller and smaller and smaller in physical size. Okay, they're doing that to squeeze in an extra seat. The problem is trying to get into a bathroom and being a normal-sized adult. Okay, it's next to impossible for your skin not to touch a faucet, a door handle, or whatever, which also contains very bad bacteria. Then, because of the physical size of the bathroom, it's become so small that whatever you're doing in the bathroom, washing your hands or whatever, we don't need to go into the specifics, you have a high propensity of being exposed to physical contact with something that is contaminated with germs. So it's a health problem just to simply use the bathroom. So that's just one area, public places that are specifically air travel. Now, also when you go from city to city and you're in hotels, et cetera, you're being exposed to all kinds of germs. So the best thing that you can do is continually wash your hands with water, something stronger than the normal antibacteriological soap. Keep your hands clean. And then you should be taking proactively all kinds of powerful antioxidants that will enable your body to fight off germs, flus, viruses. And on top of that, you should be taking herbs that have the power of herbs that are antiviral and antibacteriological. Again, I'm not a doctor, but this is what you should be doing proactively. This is what I've started to do before I go on a flight, a couple of days before and 5 days afterwards, because my body is being bombarded with infections. Also, when I go to a conference and stuff, I'll be shaking hands to 500 people. They're lovely people, but all that human contact physically, somebody sweating from their palms or whatever, the chances are enhanced that you can pick up a bacteriological infection. So I try to super boost my immune system with certain herbs that are antiviral, antibacterial. And that would include things like oregano oil. Yeah, it has that. I would rather have a bad scent than pick up something. They have oregano powdered tablets, which are pretty potent. You can take them. They don't have a bad scent. They have all kinds of antibacteriological and antiviral materials that you could be taking that you go to a good nutritional store where they know what they're talking about, And that way you can defeat proactively a lot of diseases and viruses and colds, etc. And you take stuff like silver oxide or whatever. And of course, you don't take it if you're taking all kinds of medication. That could be conflicting. And this is a great asset. Then you have to understand that you're also dealing with potentially the reality is that there are hundreds and hundreds in the United States alone of secret laboratories that are experimenting with all forms of biological warfare. That's just a reality. And if any of the biological warfare agents that they produce leak out into the general public, which has happened, it can spread very highly powerful diseases. Once again, having a supercharged immune system can help you, but you need to be aware of this, because you're not just fighting traditional bacteria and traditional forms of disease. You're fighting disease that has been manufactured in laboratories for the purpose of maximum death, disease, and destruction, biological warfare. So I'm not killing up around in paranoia, but that's an even further incentive to keep your immune system built up. And by the way, in terms of keeping your immune system built up, drinking plenty of purified water without fluoride and exercising is essential, because you have to oxygenate your body. Exercise oxygenates your body. If your body is not oxygenated, you're going to get more sicknesses and diseases. And some of these diseases are foodborne, waterborne pathogens and diseases. You should have concerns about the water supply in different cities, the food supply being contaminated, all kinds of things. And when you're in a restaurant, even a fast food restaurant, watch carefully how they're handling the food. Are they obeying the law and putting on those plastic gloves? Or are they using their fingers? How clean is that restaurant? Let me give you a little clue. You probably already know this. You didn't need me to tell you that. You go into the bathroom of any restaurant or fast food place. If the bathroom is dirty and messy and does not look sanitized and clean, I promise you 100%, if you were to sneak into their kitchen, it would be, whatever the bathroom looks like is exactly what the kitchen looks like and the sanitary conditions look like where the food is being prepared that you're eating. So I would walk out of there as fast as possible. Now, another thing that you have to understand is that, let me just give you some information. I'm giving you a list titled The Medical Aspects of Biological Warfare. I wish I didn't have to read this. This is in today's world, okay? So, I'm going to read you something. And this is just a few of the man-made pathogens or diseases that are out there. In fact, you know what? I'm not going to read them to you because they're all written, I guess, in medical Latin. But all kinds of viruses and stuff that are out there. They call it pathogen summaries. And the amount of deaths, the incubation period, and this is very, very, very serious. Now, I was listening to a lecture on TED Talks from a female biologist, and she was approaching the weakened immune systems of Americans, their propensity to get sick, to get diseases. She didn't take it from the angle of biological warfare. She took it from the angle of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and she put up some charts and stuff, and she said that what they have done, the GMO companies, when they genetically modified the organisms, the fruits and the vegetables, etc., that they sell, to be genetically modified to be resistant to weed killer. And by the way, their company started as a weed killing company. The reason that they have genetically modified all their food products, etc., to be resistant, super resistant to weed killer, is they don't want any organic farmer or any other farmer trying to create a barricade between the spread of their genetically modified crops and the organic crops. They want their GMO crops to just spread crazy and ruin the organic purity of the organic farmer, because then they know they'll put them out of business. So the way they do that is they've genetically engineered the crops of the GMO foods so that they will not that they will be totally resistant to like weed killer and things that prevent the illegal spread of their GMO crops. Now, what this biologist explained with her charts and lectures is that slight genetic modification created an entire cascade of chemical reactions, chemical defenses in the human body. And it was her thesis, as well as the thesis of many other leading doctors in the world today. She said that the number one factor that is destroying immune systems across the world, the number one factor that is causing all these new diseases and many old diseases to be regenerated, the number one thing that is causing an explosion of life-killing diseases, she said the number one thing above everything is the specific genetic modification that the GMO food companies have done in making their fruits and vegetables, etc., resistant to any chemicals that would cause the spreading of their crops, such as weed killer or whatever. That one minor genetic modification is so destructive, it's such a killer, that it is responsible, she said, to a massive number of diseases that would not normally be in the human race. So you see, if our government, the FDA, was really acting responsibly instead of playing dirty games with the big pharmaceutical companies, they would be taking care of this and you would be safe with your food supply. Now, two other things I want to touch on. The increase of EMF waves through cell phones, through 5G cell towers, through Wi-Fi, we are being bombarded in an atmosphere of electromagnetic frequency radiation at the highest levels everywhere, everything from smart meters to suns to the new 5G cell towers. So we have now bathed our planet and our bodies and our nation and our communities and our children with a toxic level of the highest level microwave radiation. Scientists have said, and I've seen videos of this, that what they call non-lethal military weapons, which include energy-directed beams, and they can have like a militarized truck, and it'll have a weapon on it which shoots out an energy beam. Okay, it's an invisible energy beam, and it can travel a huge distance. You can target people or a group of people, and in seconds after targeting them with this energy beam, directed energy beam weapon, they feel like their bodies are literally burning up to death, like their bodies have been set on fire. That's how painful it is. And so their instantaneous reaction is to run like crazy people in every direction possible, like on a subconscious primal level, in order to avoid being hit by these energy rays, which create certain sensation. Now, those are considered non-lethal weapons in that they're not designed to kill you, assuming you get out of the way. But what these scientists have said is that the new 5G cell phone towers, the new 5G cell phones, the 5G laptops, and all the 5G cell phone mini broadcasting 5G cell phone towers that are going to be put up in private neighborhoods, etc., that the level of microwave energy they generate is at the exact same level of power that the directed energy beam weapons utilize that the military uses. So in other words, this is high-powered microwave energy. If you can beam it at people a long distance away and they feel like their bodies are burning up and they're fleeing from their lives and screaming, why would you broadcast cell phone signals, computer signals, at the same level of toxic, intense microwave energy? That's highly dangerous. Why would you do that? Because you are jeopardizing the health of every baby, child, adult, anywhere where that microwave 5G energy field is being felt. Okay? And they have made no real effort to protect adults, children, old people, young children. There's no shields. There's no protection. Local communities are welcoming these transmitters like every couple of blocks inside of communities. And the level of microwave power in these things is so powerful that it can be destructive and kill over a long period of time. It may not kill instantaneously, but over a period of time it will. Why would you allow that? Yet it's being allowed. Number two is the power of these electromagnetic fields destroy the DNA in your body. It destroys your immune system. It destroys your circadian rhythms, your heart beating rhythms. It can fry your mind, your memory, and it destroys healthy DNA, and it destroys healthy nutrition. So any nutrition you may be eating that actually has nutritional value, when it's exposed to the intensity of these microwaves, you're basically eating essentially toxic substances. So this is just the beginning of what is happening, and you need to be aware of it, and you need to be proactive. And as you continue to listen to the Paul McGuire Report, we just gave you an introduction, you have to be on your game. Now, the final thing that I want to warn against, it's very interesting. As I've said to you many times before, the Lord leads me in my research. I've been writing about EMPs and microwave radiation for years, okay? As I've been researching this intensively over the last couple of months, very mysteriously, I was sent a whole series of reports from the U.S. military, from a doctor very high up in the chain of command, reports that deal with the effects of nuclear EMP attacks, microwave radiation attacks, cyber warfare attacks, etc. Now, what is the statistical probability that I would receive this brand new released report at the same time I'm doing research? I believe the Lord put this in my hands for a reason, to help you become, to have a shield up, to be healthy, to not be just victimized. You know, a lot of you listening, you don't understand that the reason you're waking up at the same time every morning with insomnia or racing hearts or a racing heartbeat is because your smart meters are kicking on. And that's the time that all your neighbors are turning on their cell phones and their laptops. Many of you are suffering from psychological and health problems. If you happen to be in the physical proximity of a cell phone tower or a series of towers, and when the 5G gets activated, you know, I've heard that they don't intend to stop it, but I've heard that they've slowed down the rollout of the 5G cell towers is because so many people have experienced severe sickness wherever they've rolled out the 5G cell towers, because it's a destroyer of the human electromagnetic system, the system that God created. God created us as electromagnetic beings. That's not New Age, that's scientific fact. So we have to do everything we can to be proactive. Now, this is the thing that concerns me the most. You'll distribute information like this. You will rationally, logically, and document scientific and medical warnings regarding people's health, as we did on today's Paul McGuire Report. But what will inevitably happen is it will somehow magically disappear from being front and center in people's minds. It will disappear. It'll, like somebody will erase it. And then the next thing you know, people will know about it, but they mysteriously won't take it seriously. And then the next thing you know, when they start installing the 5G transmitters in their neighborhoods, they won't say anything. They won't go to a local city council meeting or neighbors meeting or whatever and speak out. And the next thing you know, they won't even personally take personal proactive measures necessary to protect their babies, their brains, their bodies, and their health from the very serious effect of this high-powered EMF radiation. And the question is why? This is what we call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive meaning cognition, mental, rational, logical ability that you have, that I have. You're presented with the facts, you understand the facts, you logically, with your logical mind, understand that it presents a very real danger. Many of you are experiencing the health effects of the danger. Yet, after a certain period of time, you will do something that you know is irrational and crazy. And that's called cognitive dissonance. You will separate, you'll make the subconscious decision to separate your rational, thinking, proactive mind from another part of your mind. And they call this dissonance or dissociation. So you're presented with these truths that are factual, that require your response, changes in behavior, but you won't carry through on it. I'm not picking on you. I'm trying to explain to you why you won't carry through on it. You won't carry through on it because you will subconsciously find the information too discrete, and you will choose to enter an alternate state of consciousness called cognitive dissonance, which means you go into a psychological dissociative state or a low-grade hypnotic state where you irrationally float off into like Never Never Land of your imagination or escapism or whatever. And it is by escaping into Never Never Land that you're able to live in a dangerous environment and still have peace of mind. And the reason you have mind is because you've entered into some kind of fantasy world. You understand what I'm saying? This is classical cognitive dissonance or disassociation. So when you're confronted with very challenging realities that require changes in you and your lifestyle, instead of reacting positively, yes, instead of reacting to them and making the necessary changes, you disassociate, you mentally escape from these realities. And by doing so, you've entered a hypnotic dissociative state. That whole process that just happened to you is what is called classic scientific mind control. And this is how and why the powers that be are not afraid of the mass public or the average American finding out the truth about what's really happening. They're not afraid of that because they know with scientific predictability that when the public finds out about the danger of all these things, they will go through phases, an initial concerned, proactive phase in which they intend to do something about it, but then they are going to go into a disassociative state of consciousness where they will separate themselves from the negative reality, and that disassociative state will bring about what's called a hypnotic state, and they will choose to live in that hypnotic state as an escape mechanism. You see, that's why the elite are never worried about the people finding out the truth. Did you ever notice that? They're not worried about the people finding out the truth because they know with predictability the scientific stages of consciousness transition that the average person goes through. Now, that series of consciousness transition states of consciousness, they actually know how to manipulate it, guide it, and direct it. And that is what is called scientific mind control. You see, let me give you a more intense illustration of how scientific mind control works. Remember the Jews in Nazi Germany over and over again, rumors of their fellow Jews being arrested, tortured, sent to concentration camps, killed, gassed to death, fried in the ovens. It was, they heard an unending stories of credible reports of how their fellow Jews were disappearing, being sent to concentration camps where they were tortured, killed, and gassed to death. And they heard it over and over and over. Yet, within the ghettos, and that's what they called these areas that the Jews were confined to live in, the Jews collectively decided to create their own consciousness in which they chose to deny reality. And that denial of reality is what we call cognitive dissonance, a disassociative state, a hypnotic state. So what happened is they went through the classical psychological transition where they heard the facts and then they moved from hearing the facts to escaping from the facts, entering a disassociative or hypnotic state, and escaping and essentially denying reality. The denial of reality and the fact that they were in a hypnotic state was represented by the fact that they always said the words, "It can't happen here, it can't happen here," but it was happening there. And so this disassociative hypnotic state was so powerful that seconds before Jews would enter the gas chambers, or seconds before they would enter the area where the ovens were, they thought they were going to get a shower or a shave and cleaned up and prepared for a job. I mean, literally seconds before they walked through the door to their destruction, they were absolutely convinced that they were getting a shave and being cleaned up to be given a brand new life. That's how deeply entrenched the brainwashing was. Now, after World War II was over and the truth came out, and the Jews discovered that they had been deceived, and that 6 to 7 million Jews and Christians, etc., had died in the Holocaust, they were in a total state of shock. But the Jews made a collective choice never to allow themselves to succumb to that kind of mass mind control again. And they changed their collective vision. They no longer said things like, "It can't happen here." What the modern Jews in Israel and around the world say today is, "Never again." See, never again will the Jews allow themselves to be fooled, ever again. And never again will they fall asleep while their enemies prepare their destruction. So they have had a radical consciousness shift where they now say never again. I'm bringing this up because it was not an accident that the Jews were pacified by this groupthink called "It Can't Happen." That was the deliberate result of the implementation of Nazi propaganda, scientific mind control, behavioral conditioning, and brainwashing. That's why they were able to escape in that hypnotic state where they said it can't happen here, because of scientific mind control. They overcame scientific mind control when they saw reality, and now they choose to be sane and responsible for their lives, and their new paradigm shift is never again. This doesn't just apply to the Jews. It applies in any nation, in any circumstance, where powerful totalitarian groups are poisoning you to death. They're killing you through microwaves, through genetic engineering, and all kinds of things right in front of your face, but you can't believe that it's possible for anybody to actually do that. So you, in effect, are in a trance state saying it can't happen here. When God wants you to be alive, and you should be saying, never again. That is why I focus so much of my research and my materials on communicating messages to alert people to the dangers of hypnotic programming, scientific mind control, and brainwashing. And with everything in me, I encourage you to get a copy of American Mind Wars, the coming catastrophic event, on video, and then take advantage of the 3-book bundle discount, Conquering the Matrix, which will reveal to you whether or not you're under scientific mind control, how you can be free from it. Then the book Mass Awakening, which deals with mass mind control and how mass mind control can be used to generate evil or good, depending upon who's running the show. And then finally, A Prophecy of the Future of America, which deals with the Nazi mind control programs like MK Ultra, Operation Mockingbird, the mind control experiments, propaganda, the Illuminati music videos, symbolism, programming the subconscious, etc., and how you can defeat this and be victorious in all these areas if you learn to integrate a basic knowledge of science and the science of mind control, and you integrate biblical truths about renewing your mind, the power of the Holy Spirit, and you have a basic understanding of Bible prophecy. So visit paulmcguire.us, that's paulmcguire.us. Get those resources as if your life depended on it, because guess what? It does depend on it. And then number 2 is, join us at the upcoming Paradise Mountain Church meeting. I'd love to see you there. We worship the Lord. We teach from God's prophetic word. And it's a time of joy and celebration in the Lord Jesus Christ. And then most of all, recognize the clock is ticking. God has given us a period of time to occupy the land until he comes. And if we're faithful and diligent, God has given us the opportunity to go into all the world and preach the gospel, save souls, make disciples of all nations, truly occupy the land until he comes, and to do kingdom business until he comes. And we can do that, and we can see God supernaturally intervene in the affairs of this nation, and God will turn the tide of the spiritual battle if God's people will call on his name. And I've devoted my life and the life of this ministry to accomplishing those goals. So I want to thank God for each one of you who have obeyed the call of the Lord, and you have chosen to become intercessory prayer warriors, praying for me, my family, this ministry. I thank God for those of you that are helping us do an end run around internet censorship. And I want to thank God for every one of you who have sought the face of the Lord and are donating financially or making financial contributions that give us the money we need to expand the outreach, to reach more people, and to do it as fast as we can. I praise God for every single one of you. God bless you. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us.